The morning came the way it always did in Nashville in October, slow, grey, and carrying the smell of cold concrete mixed with the faint sweetness of bourbon that never quite left the air around Lower Broadway, even at 7 in the morning when the honky-tonks were still locked up and the neon signs sat dark in their frames like tired eyes refusing to open. Walter Kowalski pulled his jacket tighter around his chest and shifted his weight on the wooden stool he'd dragged out from the doorway of the old hardware store on the corner of Broadway and 4th Avenue. The store had been closed for 3 years. The owner, a man named Pete Dillard, had died of a heart attack behind the register, and his children, scattered across 3 different states, had never bothered to come back and sort things out. The stool had been left just inside the door, visible through the dusty glass, and one morning Walt had simply tried the door, found it unlocked, and taken it. He'd told himself he would return it someday. That was 2 years ago. The guitar case sat open at his feet, not because he was asking for money. He never put a sign out, never made eye contact with people walking past in a way that suggested he wanted anything from them, but because the case itself was easier to keep open. The latches on the left side had broken sometime around 2019, and closing it meant balancing the lid just right, which was a task his fingers, swollen at the knuckles from decades of weather and work, and one particular morning in the Quang Tri province in 1971 that he didn't allow himself to think about before noon, didn't always manage well. He set the guitar across his lap. It was a 1968 Gibson J45 sunburst finish with a crack along the lower bout that he'd repaired himself using wood glue and a strip of spruce he'd cut from a broken picture frame. The repair wasn't pretty, but it held. The guitar had belonged to his wife, Dorothy. She'd bought it at a pawn shop in Clarksville, Tennessee in 1974, 2 years before they got married, paying $32 for it over 3 installments, because that was all she could manage on a waitress salary. She'd played it badly and joyfully until arthritis took her fingers in her early 50s, and after that, it had sat in the closet of their house on Meridian Street until Dorothy died in 2018, and Walt had pulled it out, restrung it, and discovered that it still sounded like something worth hearing. He tuned it now by ear. He'd never owned a tuner. Dorothy had always laughed at that, said he had the most stubborn ears in Tennessee, and he worked through each string slowly, adjusting, plucking, adjusting again, until everything sat right in his chest, the way a tuned guitar always did, a kind of settling like a room where all the furniture had finally been pushed into its proper place. Around him, Nashville was beginning to wake. A delivery truck rumbled past on Broadway, and the driver, a young black man with headphones around his neck, glanced over at Walt with the neutral expression of someone who had seen him there before and had long since stopped wondering about him. 2 women in matching running gear jogged past on the far side of the street, their breath coming out in small, white clouds. A pigeon landed near the open guitar case, studied it for a moment with one orange eye, and then walked away with the dignified indifference of a creature that had decided the situation offered nothing of value. Walt watched the pigeon go. Then he positioned his left hand on the neck of the guitar, settled his right thumb against the low E string, and began to play. He didn't start with fancy. He never started with fancy. That song was something he worked up to, the way you work up to saying the name of someone you've lost. You have to approach it from the side, let it come at its own pace, or the weight of it will knock you flat before you even get the first word out. He started with Will the Circle Be Unbroken, which his mother had sung in the kitchen of their house in Harlan County, Kentucky, when he was 5 years old, and which still lived in his fingers the way that only the songs you learn before you know you're learning them ever do. He played it slow and clean, without embellishment, the melody sitting right on top of the chord progressions, like something that had always been there, and would always be there, long after everything else had fallen away. Then he moved into Pancho and Lefty, because Dorothy had loved Townes Van Zandt with a ferocity that had always slightly surprised him, coming from a woman who otherwise preferred order and predictability in most areas of her life. He could hear her voice sometimes when he played that song. Not a ghost, nothing like that, just the memory of her sitting in the kitchen in her bathrobe on Sunday mornings, singing along with her eyes half closed and her coffee going cold on the counter. He played for about 40 minutes, working through a loose collection of songs that had no particular theme except that they were all songs he needed. A man in a business suit walked past and dropped a $5 bill into the guitar case without breaking stride. Walt looked at it for a moment, then looked back at his hands. He wasn't going to put it back. He was 70 years old, and his Social Security check covered rent on the single room he rented from a woman named Gloria Hutchins on Shelby Avenue, and not much else. But he didn't feel good about it either. Feeling good about money had never been something he was built for. It was a few minutes past 8 o'clock when he finally let his hands settle into the opening chords of Fancy. He had not chosen the song consciously. That was how it always happened. His hands simply arrived there, the way water finds its level, and he let them go. Because she had known every word. Because she used to sing it at the top of her lungs in the car with the windows down on summer evenings when they drove out to Percy Priest Lake and sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the water go dark. The opening progression moved under his fingers with the ease of something played 10,000 times, which it very nearly was. He had been playing this song almost every day for the 7 years since Dorothy died, because it had been her favorite. He closed his eyes. This was the only part of his day when he closed his eyes willingly. There was too much in the world that required watching. He had learned that in Vietnam and never quite unlearned it. But when he played this song, with his eyes closed, he could almost put himself back in that truck, on that tailgate, with the lake going silver in the evening light and Dorothy beside him, her bare feet dangling, her voice carrying out over the water without a trace of self-consciousness, the way she did everything she loved. He played the entire song, every verse, every chorus, the instrumental break in the middle, where his right hand picked out the melody with a clarity that still surprised him sometimes, as though the guitar were compensating for everything his life had gotten wrong by being exactly right in that one narrow register. He did not hear the woman stop behind him. He did not hear her quiet footsteps on the sidewalk, or the soft sound of her breath catching slightly when she recognized the song, or the way she said something to the man beside her in a voice too low to carry, and the man nodded and stepped back, understanding without being told that this was one of those moments that required stillness. He played to the end. Let the last chord ring until it faded completely, sat with his eyes still closed for a moment, the way you sit at the end of a prayer, not because you expect anything more, but because it feels wrong to simply stand up and walk away. Then he opened his eyes and heard a voice behind him say, quietly and with complete sincerity, "That was the most beautiful version of that song I have ever heard in my life." Walt turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he's not sure what he will find. The way, he supposed, he had turned around at many moments in his life when the thing coming at him from behind had turned out to be something he hadn't expected. The woman standing on the sidewalk was wearing a dark coat, her red hair catching the grey October light. She was smiling at him with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't pity, which was what he usually got from strangers who stopped to speak to him. And it wasn't the bright performed enthusiasm of someone who felt obligated to say something nice. It was something quieter than that, something that looked improbably like recognition. It took him 3 full seconds to understand who he was looking at. When he did, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who had decided long ago not to embarrass himself by showing too much of anything, "I appreciate that." Reba McEntire looked at the guitar in his lap, then back at his face. "How long have you been playing that song?" About 50 years, Walt said, give or take. She nodded slowly as though this were the most reasonable answer she had ever received. Do you mind if I sit down? Walt looked around. There was no other stool, no bench nearby. He started to stand. Old habits from his mother's kitchen. A woman stands, you stand. But she waved him back down before he got halfway up. Don't get up, she said. I'll just... She looked around, and the man who had been standing behind her, a large, quiet man in a dark jacket who Walt now recognized as some kind of security or assistant, produced a folding chair from somewhere with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, and Reba sat down on it as naturally as if she sat on folding chairs on Nashville sidewalks every morning of her life. I'm Reba, she said, extending her hand. I know who you are, Walt said. He shook her hand. Walt Kowalski. Walt, she repeated. Are you from Nashville originally? Kentucky, he said. Harlan County. Came down here in 1976. What brought you to Nashville? He looked at her steadily. Same thing that brings everybody to Nashville. She smiled at that. Music. Music, he confirmed. Then because it felt dishonest to leave it there. Didn't work out. What happened? It was a direct question. He appreciated that. He had spent too much of his life around people who asked questions sideways, who said, how are things going, when they meant, I've heard it's been hard, and are you doing okay, when they meant you look terrible, and we're all worried. This woman was looking at him straight on and asking him what happened, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to answer her. Vietnam happened, he said simply. Went over in '69, came back in '72. By the time I got myself sorted out enough to think about music again, I had a wife and a daughter on the way. And the kind of sorted out I was talking about wasn't the kind that let you spend your evenings at open mics and your weekends driving to auditions. He paused. So I got a job at a warehouse, then another job, then another one after that. Played at church sometimes, played at home. And that was that. Reba was quiet for a moment. The city moved around them. A bus went past. Someone's phone played a fragment of a song from somewhere above them in an apartment window. A group of tourists in matching jackets appeared at the far end of the block and began moving toward them in the slow, decisive way of people following a map. That song you were playing, she said. Why that one? Walt looked down at the guitar. It was my wife's favorite. Was. She passed in 2018. I'm sorry. Thank you. He said it without deflection, without the usual reflexive dismissal. It's okay, it was a long time ago, she had a good life, because something about the way she said it made him feel that she meant it, and that it would be rude to dismiss something genuinely meant. She used to sing it, he said, every time it came on the radio. Every single time, didn't matter where we were or what we were doing, I used to tease her about it. He ran his thumb across the strings without pressing down, producing a soft, percussive whisper. I wish I hadn't teased her about it. Reba looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Mr. Kowalski, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know that it's a genuine ask, not a publicity thing or a charity thing or any of that. I've been in this business long enough that I don't need to manufacture moments. Walt waited. Would you be willing to play that song again? She said. Properly, on a real stage, with a band behind you. The morning traffic moved past them on Broadway. Somewhere in the middle distance, a church bell struck the quarter hour. Walt Kowalski, who had not stood on a stage in 47 years, looked at Reba McEntire and said, Ma'am, I think you might be making a mistake. I make mistakes all the time, she said pleasantly. This doesn't feel like one. The drive back to Shelby Avenue took Walt 22 minutes on foot, which was the amount of time he needed to not think about what had just happened. The strategy did not work. He thought about it for all 22 minutes, arriving at his room in Gloria Hutchins's house with his chest tight and his mind running in the particular circular pattern it adopted whenever something occurred that he did not have an existing category for. Gloria was in the kitchen when he came in through the back door. She was a 63-year-old retired school administrator from Memphis who had moved to Nashville after her husband left her for a woman he'd met at a dental conference, and who had converted the upstairs of her Victorian house on Shelby into 2 rentable rooms as a combination of financial necessity and Walt suspected loneliness, though she would have objected strenuously to that characterization. She was a proud woman. She made good coffee and minded her own business, which were the 2 qualities Walt valued most in a landlord. She looked up from the counter where she was cutting an apple into precise, even slices. "You're back early." "I'm back at the same time I always come back," Walt said, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. "You look like you've seen something." "I'm fine, Gloria." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you look like you've seen something." She put a slice of apple on a small plate and slid it across the counter toward him with the calm authority of a woman who had spent 30 years managing middle schoolers and knew better than to argue with people who weren't ready to talk. "There's coffee." Walt poured himself a cup, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know who Reba McEntire is?" Gloria set down her knife. "Walter Kowalski. Everybody in the continental United States knows who Reba McEntire is. She was on Broadway this morning. I was playing." He stopped. She stopped and listened. Gloria stared at him. "The whole song?" "The whole song. And then she sat down and talked to me for 20 minutes and asked me if I would play on a stage." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator cycling and the distant complaint of a car alarm somewhere on the street. "A stage," Gloria said carefully. "That's what she said." "What kind of stage?" "She said she has a benefit concert coming up. Out in Franklin, the Americana Music Foundation benefit. She said she'd been looking for an opening act, and she'd just found one." Walt wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I told her I hadn't played on a stage in 47 years. She said that was fine." Gloria sat down across from him. She had the focused, assessing expression that Walt imagined had served her well in parent-teacher conferences involving difficult fathers. "And what did you tell her?" "I said I'd think about it." "Walter." "What? You said you'd think about it?" Her voice carried the precise inflection of someone who understood that "I'll think about it" was not a statement of intention, but a defense mechanism. "I'm 70 years old, Gloria. I haven't performed in public in nearly 5 decades. I have arthritis in 3 fingers. I don't..." He stopped. "It's not a reasonable thing to say yes to." Gloria looked at him for a long moment. "Did she give you a way to reach her?" Walt reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. It was simple. A name, a phone number, an email address he would never be able to type on his phone because the screen was cracked and the letters came up half the time as something other than what he pressed. He set it on the table between them. Gloria looked at it without picking it up. "Call your son," she said. "I'm not calling Derek." "Walter." "Derek has enough going on without me calling him to tell him that a country music legend heard me playing on a sidewalk and invited me to perform at a benefit concert." He said the words in a flat, recitative tone, as though by reducing them to their factual components, he could make them sound less absurd. It didn't work. They still sounded absurd. They sounded absurd because they were absurd. "He'll think I've lost my mind." "Maybe," Gloria said, "or maybe he'll think it's the best thing that's happened to this family in a long time." She stood up, picked up her coffee cup, and moved toward the door to the hallway. Then she stopped. "That song you play every morning, fancy." She said it without looking at him. "Dorothy would have thought this was the funniest, most wonderful thing that ever happened. You know that." She left the kitchen. Walt sat at the table with his coffee and the business card and the apple slice he hadn't touched, and he thought about Dorothy, which was not unusual. He thought about Dorothy most of the time, in the background of everything. The way you're always aware of weather even when you're indoors. And he thought about what she would have said. She would have said, "Walt Kowalski, if you don't call that woman back, I will haunt you from beyond the grave, and I mean that in the least supernatural way possible." He almost smiled. The benefit concert was 3 weeks away. Informed Walt of this by phone the following morning, after Walt had spent the better part of the night sitting up in his room, playing the Gibson quietly so as not to wake Gloria, running through every song he knew well enough to play in front of people, and trying to determine whether he was being foolish or merely afraid, and whether those two things were, in his particular case, distinguishable from each other. Reba's assistant, a sharp, efficient young man named Patrick Graves, who communicated exclusively by text message and spoke in the clipped, logistics-oriented dialect of someone who managed 17 things simultaneously. He called the number on the card at 8 in the morning. Patrick Graves answered on the second ring, confirmed that yes, Ms. McEntire was expecting his call, confirmed the date and location of the event, and asked him 3 logistical questions in rapid succession. Did he need transportation? Did he play with a pick or his fingers? Did he have any dietary restrictions? Walt answered no, both depending on the song, and he was allergic to shellfish, but he doubted that was relevant to a benefit concert in Franklin, Tennessee. Patrick Graves said he would be in touch and ended the call. Walt sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he did the thing he had been avoiding, which was call his son. Derek Kowalski was 44 years old, lived in Brentwood with his wife Janet and their 2 children, and worked as a regional manager for a medical supply company. He was a serious, careful man who had inherited his mother's organizational intelligence and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which made him effective at most things and difficult in the specific area of emotional conversation. He and Walt had a relationship that functioned adequately as long as neither of them required anything from the other, that fell outside the established parameters of Sunday dinners every other week and phone calls on birthdays and the occasional shared project. They had, 2 years ago, repainted Gloria's back porch together, which had been one of the better days Walt could remember from recent years, the 2 of them working in companionable silence with the radio on, not talking about anything that mattered, and finding that to be unexpectedly enough. The phone rang 4 times. Walt was preparing himself to leave a voicemail when Derek picked up. "Dad." The word carried the particular weight of a man who loved his father and found the experience complicated. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Walt said. He stopped, decided the only way through was direct. "Something happened yesterday. I wanted to tell you." He told Derek the story. He told it plainly, without dramatization, the way he told most stories, the playing on the sidewalk, the woman stopping, the conversation, the offer. He heard Derek's breathing change somewhere around the part where he said, "Reba McEntire." A slight intake, a pause, the sound of someone recalibrating. When Walt finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds. "She asked you to perform at a benefit concert," Derek said, "in Franklin, 3 weeks from Saturday." Another silence. "Dad, how are you feeling about this?" Walt recognized the question for what it was. An attempt by his son to gauge the correct emotional response without committing to one prematurely. It was a quality that had served Derek well in business negotiations and had made him, in Walt's estimation, a somewhat exhausting person to have personal conversations with. "I said I'd do it," Walt said. "I already called back." A longer silence this time, then in a voice that Walt would replay in his head more than once over the following weeks. "Good, Dad, that's really good." It was not a complicated statement. It was 4 words and a false start and a repetition. But Derek Kowalski was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and that's really good, coming from him, with that particular unguarded quality in his voice, was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from most other people. Walt said, "I thought you'd think I was crazy." "I think you've been crazy for most of my life," Derek said, and there was something in the way he said it, dry, familiar, with the faint warmth underneath, that was the closest Derek usually came to tenderness, that made Walt's chest do something he hadn't expected. "I also think Mom would have lost her mind. That's what Gloria said. Gloria's a smart woman." A pause. "Janet's going to want to be there. Both kids, too. Derek, it's a benefit concert. Tickets are for sale to the public, Dad. I looked it up while you were talking." There was the sound of keyboard clicks. "Americana Music Foundation, Franklin, Tennessee. I'm buying them right now." Walt looked out the window of his room at the backyard of Gloria's house, where a persimmon tree was dropping its last fruit onto the grass in the pale October sunlight. He had a feeling he did not immediately have a name for. It was something adjacent to being seen, but quieter than that, more private, more his own. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Derek said. "I'll call you this weekend. Practice, okay? Don't just show up." He hung up before Walt could respond, which was, Walt reflected, a very Derek way to end a conversation. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of Walt's recent life, which was saying something, since his recent life had included the sustained strangeness of being old and alone in a city that moved at a speed he no longer matched, of watching his body renegotiate its terms on a daily basis, of filling his mornings with music, because music was the one area where time had not entirely reversed the terms of their agreement. Patrick Graves texted him twice a week with logistics. There would be a sound check the afternoon before the concert. There would be a brief introduction, not a long biographical segment. Reba had been clear about that. She wanted the music to speak and the story to come out naturally rather than being announced. And Walt would play 3 songs. 3 songs of his choosing, with the Gibson solo, no backing band, unless he wanted one. He did not want one. He called his daughter Nadine on the second Wednesday. She was 47, lived in Knoxville with her second husband, a quiet civil engineer named Bob Hargrove, and had a relationship with Walt that was warmer than Derek's but more intermittent. She called when things moved her to call, which was not always when Walt needed her to call, and the gaps between their conversations were sometimes long enough to leave a particular kind of quiet in their wake. "Daddy," she said when he told her, and the word, not Dad the way Derek said it, but Daddy, the version she'd been using since she was 3 years old, and which she deployed selectively and without self-consciousness, landed in him somewhere soft and old. "Are you serious?" "I'm serious. Reba McEntire heard you play Fancy. She was right there on the sidewalk. I didn't even know she was there." Nadine made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry, which was a sound he had heard from her a handful of times across her life, and which always moved him, because she was, like her mother, someone who felt things at full strength and made no apology for it. "I'm coming," she said. "Bob and I are coming. Don't argue with me." "I wasn't going to argue with you." "Yes, you were. You were about to say something like you don't need to do that, or it's not a big deal. And I'm telling you right now, Daddy, it is a big deal. It is a very big deal, and we are coming. And that's the end of it." Walt said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your mother would have been there, in the front row." Nadine was quiet. He could hear her breathing, and behind that the sounds of her house in Knoxville, a television somewhere, the particular ambient warmth of a lived-in place. "Yeah," she said finally, very quietly. "She would have been." He practiced every day, not on the sidewalk. For those 3 weeks he played at home, in his room, with the door closed against the rest of the house, working through the 3 songs he'd chosen with the methodical patience of a man who understood that preparation was not about eliminating fear, but about giving fear less territory to operate in. He'd chosen Will the Circle Be Unbroken first because it felt like an honest place to start. A song that belonged to everyone, that carried its weight without requiring any explanation, that was as much about the people in the room as it was about the person on the stage. He'd chosen Pancho and Lefty second because Dorothy had loved it, and because it was a song about the difference between the stories we tell about people's lives and the lives those people actually lived, which felt relevant in ways he didn't try to articulate. And he'd chosen Fancy third. Of course, he was not nervous about the playing. He was nervous about being seen, specifically about standing on a stage and having a room full of people look at him and think whatever they would think, which was a thing he had managed to avoid for most of the past 5 decades through the careful maintenance of a life lived at the margins of other people's attention. The sidewalk on Broadway had never felt like performance to him. It had felt like solitude with an audience, which was different in the way that all the most important distinctions are different, in a way that's obvious once you see it and nearly impossible to explain to someone who hasn't. But a stage was different. A stage was a claim. It said, "I am here, and what I have to offer is worth your time." Walt Kowalski had not made that claim in 47 years. He was not entirely sure at 70 years old, 3 fingers swollen with arthritis and a body that carried the accumulated invoice of a life that had asked a great deal of it, whether he still had the right to make it. He asked Gloria about this on the Thursday before the concert. He hadn't meant to. He'd come down for his morning coffee and found himself, before the coffee had finished brewing, saying the thing out loud for the first time. "What if I'm not good enough?" Gloria looked at him over the rim of her cup. Good enough for what? For a stage, for a real audience, for... He stopped. Reba McEntire heard me on a sidewalk. That's a different thing from performing. Is it? Of course it is. Why? He opened his mouth and then closed it again, because he had been about to say, because on a stage people are expecting something, and he had suddenly heard, inside that sentence, the flaw in his own reasoning. On a sidewalk, people were walking past. They were not expecting anything. They were going somewhere else, and anything they gave him was accidental and free. But Reba McEntire had stopped, had stayed for the whole song, had sat down on a folding chair on a Nashville sidewalk and asked him questions for 20 minutes. Whatever she had been expecting when she heard the first notes of that song, she had gotten something she considered worth her time. "She heard what I could do," Walt said slowly. "She heard exactly what you could do," Gloria said. "And she thought it was enough for a stage." She put her cup down. "Walt, the woman wrote the book on this kind of thing. If she thought you belonged on that stage, then you belong on that stage." Walt thought about this. Then he said, because it was true, and because Gloria had earned his honesty over 2 years of quiet mornings in her kitchen, "I'm scared." "Good," Gloria said briskly. "Being scared means you know it matters. People who don't get scared before they do something important are either lying or they don't care, and you've never been a liar, and you've always cared about everything too much." She picked up her cup again. "Finish your coffee." The drive to Franklin took 43 minutes in Derek's SUV, with Janet in the passenger seat and the 2 kids, 14-year-old Cooper and 11-year-old Maisie, in the back beside Walt, who had the Gibson in its case across his knees because the trunk was full of hockey equipment that Cooper had not, apparently, gotten around to removing, and because he found he didn't want the guitar out of his reach. It was the Friday before the concert. They were going down early for the sound check and then spending the night at a Holiday Inn off the interstate. Derek had booked 2 rooms. He had told Walt this with the careful, practical tone he used when he was doing something generous and preferred not to make a thing of it. Maisie had been studying Walt with the frank, unself-conscious curiosity of an 11-year-old for most of the drive. He had always gotten along well with Maisie. She asked questions the way children do when they are genuinely interested in the answers, without the adult's protective layer of pretending not to want to know things. Grandpa, she said somewhere around the exit for Brentwood, are you going to be famous? No, Walt said, but Reba McEntire picked you. She picked me for one concert. That doesn't make a person famous. Maisie considered this. But it might make you a little bit famous. Maisie, Derek said from the front seat, I'm just saying. It's all right, Walt said. He looked at his granddaughter's face, round and serious and lit from within by the uncomplicated conviction that things that were good should be recognized as good, a quality that life would, with time, complicate, but that was, right now, in its full unmodified form, one of the most genuinely beautiful things Walt knew. No, sweetheart, I'm not going to be famous. I'm going to play 3 songs for people who came to hear Reba McEntire, and most of them will enjoy it and then forget about it, and that's fine. That's what it should be. But will you remember it? Walt looked out the window at the Tennessee countryside moving past in the last of the afternoon light. The hills were brown and gold with the end of fall, the sky going pale at the edges, the kind of late-day October light that has the quality of something remembered rather than something seen. Yeah, he said, I'll remember it. The venue was a restored 19th century mill building on the edge of Franklin's historic district, converted into an event space sometime in the early 2000s. It sat beside a narrow creek that caught the last of the daylight and held it in long, rippling pieces on the surface of the water. And the building itself, wide wooden beams, brick walls, high windows, had the solid, unaffected beauty of a thing built to last by people who knew the difference between permanence and decoration. Patrick Graves met them at the side entrance. He was younger than Walt had imagined from the texts, mid-20s, quick-eyed, with the energy of someone who had learned to process information at high speed and found stillness mildly uncomfortable. Mr. Kowalski, he said, extending his hand. Good drive. Fine drive, Walt said. Great. Sound checks in 40 minutes. I'll show you the stage. He looked at Derek and Janet and the kids. Families welcome to watch from the floor. The stage was modest, by concert standards, a raised platform maybe 20 feet across with a simple lighting rig overhead and a single microphone stand at center. Spent 20 minutes with Walt getting the mic levels right, adjusting the monitor speaker so Walt could hear himself without the feedback loop that had plagued his one and only previous experience with a stage monitor in 1976. The sound engineer, a heavy-set man named Roy Castillo, who wore his grey hair in a short ponytail and spoke in the unhurried cadence of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years and had stopped being impressed by anything except competence. You play soft, Roy observed, not critically. Some players push at a mic, you back off. Is that a problem? Nope. Just means I set the gain differently. Play me a verse of something. Walt played the opening verse of Will the Circle Be Unbroken. Roy adjusted 2 knobs, nodded, had him play it again, nodded again. You're good, Roy said. Don't change anything you're doing. The room will fill up and absorb some of the mid. I'll compensate. Just play like you play. Walt nodded. From the floor, he could hear Maisie say something to Cooper in a low voice. And Cooper's response, quiet, but not dismissive. He glanced out and found Cooper watching him with an expression he hadn't expected from a 14-year-old boy, which was something close to attention. Real attention, the kind that isn't performed. He played the sound check through to its end. When he finished the last chord of Fancy, just once through for the levels, Roy said good and began making notes on a clipboard, and Patrick Graves materialized with a bottle of water and a schedule for the following evening. And Derek came up the steps to the side of the stage and stood beside Walt for a moment without saying anything. Then Derek said, "It sounds different in here than it does in your room." "I haven't played in your room," Walt said. "I mean, it sounds..." Derek stopped, tried again. "It sounds like it's supposed to be here." Walt looked at his son. Derek was looking at the stage, not at him, with the sideways expression of a man making an admission he hadn't entirely prepared himself for. Your mother always said I should have kept playing, Walt said. I know. She said it to me, too. Derek paused. She said you stopped because of us, because of the family. That's not entirely true. What's the true part? Walt thought about it. I stopped because I was afraid. The family was a reason, but it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I'd been to Vietnam, and I'd come back, and I didn't. I wasn't sure anymore that what I had to offer was worth anything, to anyone. I played for your mother because she made me feel like it was, but I couldn't get up on a stage and make that claim to strangers. He paused. I was 25. I should have been braver. Derek was quiet for a long moment. The sound engineer had gone backstage. The venue was empty except for the two of them on the stage, and Janet and the kids on the floor below. Janet scrolling her phone, Maisie drawing something in a small notebook she carried everywhere. Cooper still watching Walt with that focused, uncharacteristic attention. "You're being brave now," Derek said. He said it the way he said things he meant, simply, without ornament, looking straight ahead. "At 70. That's not nothing, Dad." Walt looked at his hands, the knuckles of the left hand. The crack in the guitar's lower bout, repaired with wood glue and a strip of spruce from a broken picture frame. "No," he said, "I don't think it is." Reba came by the venue that evening briefly. She had dinner commitments in Nashville and had driven down specifically to check in on the setup, and Walt suspected, to see how he was doing, though she would not have put it that way. She found him and Derek in the small green room off the backstage corridor, eating sandwiches that Patrick Graves had produced from a cooler with the same calm efficiency with which he produced everything. "Walt," she said, coming through the door with the particular quality of presence that Walt had noticed on the sidewalk. Not loud, not commanding, but definite, in the way that people are definite when they've spent long enough being certain of who they are. She shook Derek's hand, said she was glad the family was coming, asked Walt how the sound check had gone. "Roy's good," Walt said. "The best," she agreed. She sat down across from him and looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the sidewalk, with that directness that he'd decided, over 3 weeks of thinking about it, was simply her natural mode of attention. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Walt said. Then, because she had asked in a way that meant she actually wanted to know, "Scared." "Good," she said, and her voice had exactly the same quality as Gloria's had when she'd said the same thing, which Walt found both reassuring and slightly unsettling. "What are the 3 songs?" he told her. She nodded at each one, and when he named Fancy last, she looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, something warm and complicated and entirely genuine, and said, "I'm going to be in the wings for that one." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." She left 20 minutes later, and Walt and Derek ate their sandwiches in a silence that was, for the first time in a long time, entirely comfortable. The night of the benefit concert was cold and clear, the kind of Tennessee October night where the stars come out hard and bright against a sky that's gone deep blue at the edges, and the air carries a smell of wood smoke from somewhere you can't identify. And the cold gets into your bones, not unpleasantly but honestly, the way cold does when it has nowhere to hide. Walt arrived at the venue at 5:30, 2 hours before the doors opened. He wore the same dark jacket he always wore, a white shirt beneath it that he'd ironed himself that morning, with the concentration of a man performing a task he hadn't performed in several years. His boots were clean. His hair, still thick at 70 despite everything else, was combed. He had decided, somewhere in the course of the previous night's sleeplessness, that if this was going to be the one night in the last 47 years that he stood on a stage, he was going to stand on it looking like himself, rather than like a performance of himself, which meant the dark jacket and the white shirt and the boots and the Gibson and nothing else. Gloria had come. He had tried to dissuade her, citing the drive, the cold, the inconvenience, and she had listened to all of his arguments with polite attention and then said she had already bought her ticket and would be driving herself, thank you, and that she expected to see him before the show if he could manage it. She was in the green room when he arrived, talking to Janet with the ease of two women who had immediately recognized each other as people worth talking to. She looked up when Walt came in. "You look good," she said. "You drove yourself all the way to Franklin." "I did," she agreed unrepentantly. Nadine and Bob arrived at 6, slightly breathless from the drive from Knoxville, Nadine wearing the bright, fierce expression that Walt associated with her at moments of emotional intensity, not tearful, not effusive, but lit up from somewhere inside. The way Dorothy had been lit up, the family resemblance never more visible to him than in those moments. She hugged him for a long time without saying anything. Bob shook his hand with the warm, uncomplicated firmness of a man who understood exactly what was appropriate and delivered it without fanfare. "How many people will be there tonight?" Nadine asked Patrick Graves, who had appeared with the bottle of water. "Sold out, 800 seats." Nadine looked at Walt. "Don't," Walt said. "I'm not doing anything. You're making a face. It's my face, I can't help it." She touched his arm. 800 people, Daddy. I know. Mom would have. I know, Nadine. She nodded, pressed her lips together, looked away, and then back. "You're going to be incredible. I'm going to play 3 songs. Incredibly," she said. The show was scheduled to begin at 7:30. Walt was the opening act. 10 minutes on stage, 3 songs, and then the evening proper would begin with a local string quartet playing Americana arrangements, followed by 2 Nashville-based singer-songwriters, and Reba closing the night with a 90-minute set. At 7 o'clock, Patrick Graves found Walt standing in the wings, looking out at the audience filling the seats. 800 people. The room had the temperature and the specific acoustic quality of a space that is absorbing human warmth and sound and beginning to transform them into something else, the way a concert hall always does in the 30 minutes before a show begins. The individual conversations and movements and small adjustments of clothing becoming gradually a single shared state of waiting. 5 minutes to intro, Patrick said. "You need anything?" "No. Roy's got you dialed in. Just play like you played at the sound check. Don't push at the mic." "I know." Patrick looked at him for a moment. "Ms. McEntire wanted me to give you something." He held out a folded piece of paper. "She wrote it herself, said you should read it before you go on." Walt took the paper, unfolded it. "Read it," it said in a handwriting that was clear and unhurried, and had the quality of someone who said what they meant. "Walt, that song belongs on every stage it's ever missed. Tonight, it's making up for lost time. Go play it like you played it on that sidewalk, because that version was the truest thing I've heard in years." Walt folded the paper, put it in the pocket of his jacket, stood in the wings for another moment, feeling the weight of the Gibson across his back where it was slung by its strap, and the specific texture of the October air in this old mill building where the brick walls still held some memory of cold despite the warmth of 800 people, and the sound of the room in the last moments before it changed. He thought about Dorothy. He did this without ceremony. He thought about her the way he breathed, continuously and without deciding to, and she was there in the way she was always there, not as a ghost or an absence, but as a presence that had simply taken a different form, the way water takes a different form when it becomes the river it came from. He thought about her sitting on the tailgate of the truck at Percy Priest Lake, bare feet dangling, singing this song at the top of her lungs without self-consciousness or apology, her voice carrying out over the dark water in the summer evening. "Go play it like you played it on that sidewalk." The announcer, a woman from the Americana Music Foundation named Carol Adkins, whose voice had the warm, practiced confidence of someone who had introduced hundreds of performers and understood the responsibility of a first impression, stepped up to the microphone in the center of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight in support of the Americana Music Foundation. Before we begin our program, we have a very special treat. 3 weeks ago, on a sidewalk on Lower Broadway in Nashville, a woman heard a man play a song, and she stopped and she listened and she thought, "This man belongs on a stage." The man is a United States Army veteran, a Nashvillian by choice for 50 years, and a guitarist whose hands know things that most of us will spend our whole lives trying to learn. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Walt Kowalski. 800 people applauded. It was not the thunderous applause that would greet Reba later in the evening. It was the curious, generous, slightly uncertain applause of an audience welcoming someone they didn't know. An audience deciding in real time to give a man a chance. Walt walked out. The stage lights were not blinding. Roy had set them at a warm, moderate level because Patrick had told him that the performer was not accustomed to stage lighting and they didn't want to lose him in the first 10 seconds. Maisie beside him with her small notebook on her lap but closed. Gloria 2 rows back with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of calm, focused attention. Nadine with Bob's arm around her shoulders. Derek to Nadine's left, looking at his father with an expression that Walt had not seen on his son's face since Derek was very young, and which he recognized with a precision that went straight through his chest as pure and uncomplicated pride. The lights were the color of late afternoon almost, and the faces in the first few rows were visible to Walt as individual faces. An older couple near the center, a group of women in their 40s toward the left, Cooper in the 4th row, sitting up straight in a way he hadn't sat up straight in the SUV. Walt sat down on the stool that Roy had placed at center stage. He unslung the Gibson, settled it on his knee, adjusted the position of the microphone, looked out at the room. He said, "My wife Dorothy's favorite song was Fancy by Reba McEntire." His voice was level and clear in the room. She sang it every time it came on the radio. Every time. Didn't matter where we were or what we were doing. She'd sing it full voice, no apology. He paused. "She passed in 2018. I've been playing this song every morning since then because it's the best way I know to spend 15 minutes with somebody I miss." He looked down at the guitar. "I'm going to play 3 songs tonight. The last one's hers." He began with, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" The room received it the way rooms receive something that is done exactly right, with a quality of listening that is distinct from the ordinary attention people bring to entertainment, a quality that is closer to stillness, to the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of feeling, but its most concentrated form. Walt played with his eyes open this time, watching the faces in the first rows, and what he saw there was something he had not expected, which was that people were leaning forward. He moved through the song with the ease of something played 10,000 times, and when he reached the end of the last verse and let the final chord ring out and then fade into the warmth of the room, the applause came back at him in a wave that was entirely different in character from the polite welcome applause, warmer, fuller, with an element of surprise in it, the sound of 800 people revising their expectations upward. He played Pancho and Lefty second. He had considered saying something about Dorothy before this one too. She'd loved it, and the connection was real. But he decided against it. The song could speak for itself. It always had. He was in the 3rd verse when he heard, from somewhere in the room, a woman begin to sing along under her breath. He couldn't see her. She was somewhere to his left, beyond the visible edge of the stage lighting, but he could hear her, and the sound of it, quiet and involuntary, the sound of someone who knew every word because they'd sung it all their lives, made his fingers press harder into the strings in the way they did when a song was working, when the room and the music and the person playing it were all pulling in the same direction. When the song ended, the applause was louder still. He sat for a moment. 800 people waited. He could feel the specific quality of waiting in the room. Attentive, patient, present. He looked down at the Gibson, the repaired crack in the lower bout. The sunburst finish that had faded over the years to something more complex and beautiful than the original. The way aged things are when they've been used and loved and used again. "This one's for Dorothy," he said. And he played Fancy, but with the directness of a man who had played this song 10,000 times, because it was the closest he could get to a person he loved, and who was playing it now in a room of 800 people with the same unguarded fullness he brought to it at 7 in the morning on an empty street with no one watching. He played it the way he played it every morning on the sidewalk on Broadway, which was to say, he played it with everything, not with the controlled technical precision of a performer calculating the effect on an audience. His eyes were open this time. He watched the room. In the second verse, he saw Nadine put her hand over her mouth. In the chorus, he saw Gloria close her eyes. In the third verse, he saw Cooper, 14 years old, a boy who communicated primarily through single-syllable responses and the studied indifference of adolescence, leaned forward in his seat with his elbows on his knees and his face turned toward the stage with an expression of pure, unguarded attention that Walt would remember for the rest of his life. He played the instrumental break in the middle with a clarity that surprised even himself, the melody sitting right, his right hand finding the notes with a precision that was not mechanical but felt, the way things feel when they are happening at the exact right moment. And then he was in the final verse, and then the final chorus, and then the last chord, and he let it ring. The room was completely silent for 1, 2, 3 full seconds. Then the applause began, and it was not like the applause that had come before. It was standing applause, coming up from the floor of the audience in a motion that began in the front rows and moved backward through the room like something inevitable. Like weather, like the way light moves when it finds a gap in the clouds, and Walt sat on the stool with his hands still on the guitar and looked out at 800 people on their feet and felt, for the first time in 47 years, the specific and irreplaceable sensation of a room full of people receiving something you have offered and finding it worth the receiving. From the wings, stage left, he heard a sound above the applause, a single voice joining in, singing the last line of the chorus one more time, quietly, into the wings. He turned his head. Reba McEntire was standing in the wings, her hand pressed to her chest, singing the last line of her own song back to the man who had just played it for his wife. She was not performing. She was simply, quietly, present for the moment. The way she had been present on the sidewalk 3 weeks before, the way some people are present for things that matter because they have learned, over long years, to recognize what matters when they see it. Walt looked at her. She nodded at him. A small, certain nod, the kind that doesn't need words, and he turned back to the room, to 800 people still on their feet, and he felt something let go in him that had been held for a very long time. He stood up from the stool. Bowed once, briefly, the way his mother had taught him. You bow because the audience gave you something and you're acknowledging it. Not because you're thanking them for validating you, there's a difference, and walked off the stage. In the usual Kowalski family style, loud or demonstrative, but was instead simply present, all of them crowding into the narrow corridor beside the stage in the warm aftermath of the performance. The backstage area was small enough that everyone arrived at once. Patrick Graves with a bottle of water, Roy the sound engineer saying, "That's the best open I've had all year." And then Derek, who had come through the side door from the audience floor with Nadine right behind him, and Janet and Gloria and Bob and Cooper and Maisie, all following in a cluster that was not. Derek put his arms around his father. He did not do this often. The last time Walt could specifically remember, it was at Dorothy's funeral, and before that, sporadically, across the years in the way of fathers and sons who love each other without knowing quite how to say so. He stood there in the corridor with Derek's arms around him and felt, in a way that was entirely physical and not at all reducible to language, the weight of what they had missed and the weight of what was still here, and the two things were not the same, but they were not entirely separate either. "That was something, Dad," Derek said into his shoulder. "Yeah," Walt said, "it was." Nadine took her turn and held him for a long time and said nothing at all, which was the right thing. Gloria touched his arm and said, "Dorothy would have been unbearable tonight, honestly. She would have been insufferable. She would have told absolutely everyone," in a voice so fond that Walt had to look away for a moment. Cooper, 14, careful, self-contained, stood slightly apart from the group until Walt looked over at him specifically, and Cooper met his grandfather's eyes and said, with the deliberate flatness of someone who means something more than the words, "You were really good." "Thank you, Cooper." "I didn't know you could. I mean, I knew you played, but I didn't know it was like that." Walt looked at his grandson for a moment. "You want to learn sometime?" Cooper blinked. The question had clearly not been anticipated. "Learn guitar?" "That's what I'm offering." Cooper was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Yeah, I think I'd want to." Maisie, who had been standing beside her brother with her notebook pressed to her chest, said immediately, "Me too." "You too," Walt said. Reba found him 20 minutes later when the corridor had cleared and the string quartet was warming up on the stage above them and the benefit concert had resumed its proper course. She came through the door from the stage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had exactly 10 minutes before she was needed elsewhere, and she sat down across from Walt in 2 folding chairs that Patrick Graves had positioned against the brick wall with his customary unobtrusive competence. "How do you feel?" she asked. Walt thought about it honestly, like something that was closed for a long time just opened. She nodded slowly. "That's the thing about music," she said. "It doesn't go anywhere. You can leave it alone for decades and it just waits. It doesn't hold it against you. I held it against myself. Most people do." She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands of a woman who had played and sung and worked for decades, who understood what it meant to have given your life to something and what it cost. "You have students now, I hear." "My grandchildren," he almost smiled, "as of about 15 minutes ago." "Good." She looked up. "Walt, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering it." He waited. "There's a music program," she said, "through the foundation that put this concert together. It works with veterans, men and women who played before their service, or who picked up instruments after they came back, or who never played at all and want to start. They work out of a community center in East Nashville. They need someone with experience and patience and the kind of authority that doesn't come from credentials." She paused. "It comes from having lived something." Walt looked at the brick wall across from him. The old mill building's interior walls were rough and varied, the bricks laid by hands that had worked in the 1880s, and the texture of them held, in the way that old things hold, the faint impression of time. Of all the purposes this space had served, the work and the weather and the generations of use that had brought it to this particular moment, this particular conversation. "I don't have credentials," he said. "I know that. That's why I'm asking you and not someone with credentials. I'm 70 years old. I know how old you are. I have arthritis in 3 fingers. Walt." Her voice was patient and direct. "I'm not asking you to audition. I'm asking you if you want to do something with what you have while you have it, because you have more than you think. You've always had more than you think. I knew that the second I heard you play." Walt sat with this for a long moment. Through the wall above them, he could hear the opening notes of the string quartet's first piece, something that moved through the old building with a sound that was both fragile and persistent, the way music is when the room is right and the people are listening. He thought about the sidewalk on Broadway, about 7 in the morning and the cold and the pigeon and the $5 bill he hadn't wanted, about the Gibson with its repaired crack, about Dorothy on the tailgate of the truck, about Derek saying "that's really good" in a voice that had something unguarded in it, about Cooper sitting up straight in the 4th row with his face turned toward the stage, about 47 years, and what they had cost and what they had left. "When do they meet?" he said. Reba smiled. It was not a victorious smile. It was the smile of someone who had known what the answer was going to be and was glad to be proven right. "Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6 o'clock. I'd need a ride for the Thursday session. My truck—" He paused. "I don't have a truck anymore. I take the bus. I'll have Patrick arrange something. I don't need charity transportation. It's a volunteer position," she said evenly. "Transportation is part of it. Don't make it complicated." Walt considered objecting again and decided against it. Some arguments were not worth the energy they cost, and this was one of them. All right, she echoed. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and looked at him with the same expression she'd had on the sidewalk, that directness, that quality of seeing something clearly and being willing to say so. "You did something tonight, Walt. Something real. Don't let it close back up." She left the way she'd come, through the door to the stage, and Walt sat alone for a moment in the folding chair with the sounds of the concert moving through the walls and the old bricks holding their patient record of everything they'd witnessed. And he thought about what she'd said, "Don't let it close back up." He thought about the first Tuesday meeting. He thought about sitting across from veterans, men and women who had carried things he would recognize, who had come back from places that left marks that don't show on the outside, who had found or lost or never had the particular consolation that music offers, which is not escape but presence, not forgetting but the ability to feel something fully without being destroyed by it. He thought about what he would tell them if they asked him how he'd learned to play. He would tell them the truth, that he'd learned in a kitchen in Harlan County from a mother who sang hymns while she cooked, that he'd played in Vietnam because there were hours of stillness between the hours that were not still, and a guitar filled the stillness in a way that nothing else did. That he'd put it down for reasons that had seemed at 25 like practical necessity, and that he understood now at 70 to be a form of self-erasure that he did not recommend. That he'd picked it back up because a woman he loved had left it for him to find. That last part was Dorothy's gift. He hadn't seen it that way at first. He'd seen the guitar as a remnant, an artifact, something to keep because it had been hers and he couldn't part with it. But it had turned out to be something else. It had turned out to be an instruction. Keep playing. He stood up from the folding chair. His knees announced themselves in the way they had been announcing themselves for the past 5 years, with the weary, democratic indifference of joints that were done pretending the decades hadn't happened. He picked up the Gibson from where it leaned against the wall, slung it over his shoulder, and walked back down the corridor toward the green room, where his family was waiting. Derek drove home a different way than they'd come. Not intentionally, just the way of unfamiliar roads in the dark. And they went through the center of Franklin, past the old courthouse and the rows of lit storefronts, through the part of town where the historic district gives way to the ordinary residential streets that hold most of any place's actual life. The kids were quiet in the back. Maisie had fallen asleep against Cooper's shoulder, her notebook still clutched in one hand, and Cooper was looking out the window with his headphones around his neck, but not on his ears. Which Walt had learned was Cooper's way of being present without announcing it. Janet had turned on the radio softly, a country station, the late-night programming, old songs, and they were somewhere on the highway between Franklin and Nashville when a song came on that Walt recognized from the first 3 notes. It was not fancy. It was an older Reba McEntire song, one from the early 80s, and he didn't know it by name the way he knew some songs, but he knew it the way you know music that you've absorbed without intending to, through the accumulated presence of years and radio stations and the particular cultural atmosphere of Tennessee, where country music moves through the air like weather. "Dad?" Derek said from the front seat, quietly enough not to wake Maisie. "Yeah. I've been thinking about something you said at the venue before the show, about stopping because you were afraid." "Derek, I'm not trying to get into anything. I just wanted to say—" He paused. He had his eyes on the road, and his voice had the careful, deliberate quality of a man choosing words he'd been carrying for a while. "I stopped playing basketball in 9th grade because Coach said I wasn't fast enough, and I told Mom it was because I wanted to focus on school," which was true. But the real reason was, I was afraid I'd keep not being fast enough, and I didn't want to find out. He paused again. "I've been thinking about that for a long time. I just never said it out loud to anyone." Walt looked at his son's profile in the dark of the car. 44 years old. Careful, serious, good. A man who had built a solid life from solid materials, and who carried beneath the solidity the same things his father carried, the same particular form of fear that disguises itself as practicality, that tells you the door is closed when really you've simply stopped trying the handle. "It's not too late to be afraid of something and do it anyway," Walt said. "I just demonstrated that, I think." Derek gave a short, quiet sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually got when something genuinely moved him. "Yeah, you did." They drove in silence for a while. The radio played. The highway lights went past at their steady intervals. Cooper leaned his head back against the headrest, and his eyes were closed now, and he looked in the particular openness of near sleep, very much like his father had looked at that age, and very much like Dorothy. Walt watched the road unwind ahead of them and held the Gibson in its case on his lap, and thought about Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 o'clock. About a room of people who had carried things a long time. About the particular quality of a guitar in the hands of someone who has never been told their sound is worth making. The tentativeness of it, and the potential underneath the tentativeness, and what it felt like to be the person who helped someone understand that the potential was real. He'd spent 47 years convinced that the door was closed. He was not sure, looking back, when exactly he had stopped trying the handle. Somewhere in the years of the warehouse and the kids and the accumulating weight of ordinary necessity, the story he told himself had shifted. From "I haven't played yet" to "I don't play anymore." And the distance between those two phrases, which had seemed at the time like a simple acknowledgement of fact, was actually the distance between a life that had room in it and one that had quietly, gradually, decided it didn't. Dorothy had known. She always knew. She had watched him close the door and said nothing directly. She had been too wise to say anything directly because she understood, as she understood most things about him, that the door could only be opened from the inside. But she had left him the guitar. Keep playing. Outside the window, Nashville was approaching, the glow of it coming up against the sky the way cities do, an ambient brightness that softens the stars at the horizon and announces, from miles away, that there are people here, and light, and noise, and all the complicated, irreducible business of human life proceeding in its ordinary and extraordinary ways. Walt Kowalski was 70 years old. He had arthritis in 3 fingers. He had a single room in Gloria Hutchins' house on Shelby Avenue and a social security check that covered the rent and not much else, and a 1968 Gibson J45 with a repaired crack and a faded sunburst finish and 50 years of music in its wood. He had a son who was going to spend the next several months thinking about a door he had closed in 9th grade. He had a daughter who called him Daddy and felt things at full strength without apology. He had 2 grandchildren who had, 15 minutes after his performance, become his students. He had a Tuesday and Thursday at 6 o'clock. He had the memory of 800 people on their feet, and the memory of Dorothy on a tailgate, and the memory of a woman in a dark coat on a Nashville sidewalk, saying, with complete sincerity, "That was the most beautiful version of that song I have ever heard in my life." He had, it turned out, more than he had thought. The car pulled off the highway at the Shelby Avenue exit, and the familiar streets of East Nashville moved past the windows. The old Victorian houses, the corner store with its sign still lit, the persimmon tree at the edge of Gloria's backyard visible from the street, its last fruit fallen, the branches bare and clean against the night sky. Derek pulled up in front of the house, turned off the engine, turned around. "Same time next week for dinner," he said. "Same time," Walt said. He got out of the car, stood on the sidewalk with the Gibson on his back, and watched the SUV pull away. The night was cold and very clear, and the street was quiet the way streets are quiet at 11 o'clock in October when the season has turned and people have gone inside. Somewhere a few blocks away, a dog barked once and was quiet. The persimmon tree stood in the side yard, its branches holding the particular stillness of things that have shed what they needed to shed and are ready now for whatever comes next. Walt stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He was not ready to go inside yet. He unslung the Gibson from his shoulder. Stood there on the sidewalk of Shelby Avenue in the October cold, with the guitar in his hands, the way he stood every morning on Broadway, and played, very quietly, the opening bars of Fancy. Not for anyone. Not to anyone. The street was empty. The houses were dark. There was no audience, no stage, no sound check, no folding chairs. There was only the old guitar and the cold air and the bare persimmon tree and the memory of Dorothy singing and the particular quality of 11 o'clock in October when the year is turning and the world has gone quiet enough to hear itself. He played it all the way through, let the last chord ring until it faded completely. Stood with the silence for a moment, the way you stand at the end of a prayer. Then he picked up the guitar case, walked up the porch steps, and went inside.